Start recording. As soon as Hunter gets back. Just walking on his own. There we go. All right. Morning, everybody. So, good news is all of your midterm papers are graded. Yay! So you can see those in the portal, and I'll get the midterm grades, the official midterm grades, right into the registrar after class. So, of course, your midterm grade is a up to this point reflection. Doesn't affect the GPA. It's not a permanent thing. And the way that I designed the course to flow, you have ample opportunity post midterm to change your grade. So if you get a grade that you're not especially pleased with, not the end of the world. Don't give up. Don't think, well, this is going to be my final grade. There's some courses that by the time you get to midterms, like you can shift it like plus to minus. You can't shift it very much. That's not the way this class works. You can significantly change your grade if you're willing to apply yourself. And the big element of that is in the revisions of this paper. So I gave you guys all some pretty detailed feedback. And at times, if it seems like I got nitpicky, it's because I did. I provided you feedback on grammar, on structure, on content, on your APA formatting, on all of that, for you to become better communicators. Because as managers, you're going to need to be able to communicate as effectively as possible. I will send out a link that you will use to schedule time with me. We will go over those notes and those comments, and you'll have an opportunity to ask me, well, what do you mean by this? We can go over some strategies for how to revise. Because again, I want you guys to have every possible tool and opportunity and resource at your disposal in order to write the best paper you possibly can, and to learn the most through this process that you possibly can. As an educator, that's sort of my job. So yeah, so be on the lookout for that. Go ahead, go in and review the paper, review the notes that I left you, then let me know if you guys have any questions. Sound good? Okay. Also wanted to follow up from Wednesday. It was brought to my attention that some people were unhappy with some of the stuff we talked about on Wednesday. And so I wanted to say, if I hurt your feelings, offended anybody, made anybody feel extremely uncomfortable, I want to echo from Wednesday that I'm sorry. It wasn't my intention at all. I meant what I said when I said, come talk to me. Some people chose not to, and that's okay. I'm not upset that they chose not to. I just want you to know that part of the learning is engaging with ideas that you don't like, or that you don't find valid, or that you find uncomfortable. And so part of that would be if I said something that you don't think is good, or that you think came across in a negative way. That wasn't my intention, and so I'd like you to come talk to me about it, because that's where learning happens. When people who don't see eye to eye, who hold different perspectives of things, have a dialogue. And so I would appreciate the opportunity to do that with you, both so that I can learn and so that you can learn. As we move into today, we're going to sort of continue and build off of that. So I wanted to preface it, just letting you know that as we continue to talk about this, if you continue to have concerns, if you continue to be uncomfortable with the content, I do want you to come talk to me, because that's part of why I'm here. You can still feel free to talk to other people about it, but I think the best learning opportunity is going to happen when the professor and the student talk. And that's ultimately where the best learning happens, where we critically engage with things, not just that we already agree with or that we already think, but that we critically engage with things that we don't already think, or that are different than what we've heard presented in the past. So yeah, with that preface, we're going to dive in. We're going to continue from what we were talking about. We're going to talk about inclusion, because diversity for the sake of diversity is tokenism. Diversity for the sake of a photo op is fake and surface at best. Inclusion is patterns of behavior in management. Inclusion is creating a culture and organization where those different voices and perspectives that we talked about on Wednesday, trying to bring together the people to the table, putting people in positions of decision making that we talked about. It's making them want to be there, making them want to stay there, feeling like they have some ownership in that organization, feeling like they deserve, they need, they want to contribute in that space. And that's what inclusion is. It really is the vital second part. And that's why we talk about diversity and inclusion together so often, is because it really is that vital second part. You can bring people to the table. Remember the story of the buckets. You can bring a woman into the boardroom, but if you bring her in, ask her a question, and kick her back out, you've not really solved the problem. You've not really addressed the underlying issue. You've simply checked a box for a particular meeting, and then there's been no underlying growth in your organization. But if you can create sustainable patterns of inclusion, you can bring those different voices, those different perspectives that are so vital to bear. A couple things about that, and the reason why that inclusion piece is so important is because the diversity that we often seek and that we often see talked about, there's significant amount of research to bear this out. So it's talked about in text, and it exists in other places online. Finds that diverse teams that are not homogenous, okay, that are not all people of the same sex or all people of the same race, are actually in the early stages less efficient at making decisions and at getting things done. So we're going to stop right there. I'm going to ask the question: why do you think teams that are more diverse are less efficient in the short term? What might be a cause of that?
Getting to know each other period of time.
Yeah, okay. Hunter.
Sometimes being afraid to state your opinion and what you know, obviously just because you don't know them, but two, you don't know how people are going to react sometimes.
Right, so it's a fear of being authentic and honest about your perspective, because you haven't built trust yet with all of your teammates. Okay. What else?
It's going to take a lot more discussion time to reach like a consensus.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole point of having a more diverse team, is to have multiple points of view. If you have multiple points of view, then you can only react to a situation once. It takes time for that team to reach some sort of consensus. And so research actually bears out, and this is an important point from the management literature, because sometimes when you hear diversity talked about in the popular media, it's that just create a diverse team and all your problems will go away. Just do diversity and then everything will be this golden utopia. And that's just not the case. Putting together a diverse team does not instantaneously solve problems. It doesn't instantaneously make for better results. And it doesn't even long-term make for more efficient problem solving. But what the research shows is that in the short term, a homogeneous team will outperform a diverse team, because some of the social aspects of decision-making can be, if not skipped over, at least gone through much more quickly. You already have that shared background with people, you already have that shared perspective with people. It's much easier to just dive into the problem. There are less points of view to reconcile. And so, like I said, consensus is easier to find in a homogeneous group. So you're able to make quicker decisions. But what the research also shows us is that diverse teams over time, if they're given the opportunity, if they stay intact, diverse teams, Once people are given the opportunity to get to know each other, to build trust, to discuss different opinions, different perspectives, different points of view, diverse teams, while they don't make more efficient decisions, they don't make decisions quicker, they make much, much higher quality decisions because they're entertaining more perspectives on any given issue. They think more deeply about issues. They consider more dimensions of environment. They do exactly what you would think that a team of multiple perspectives would do. They actually think through the problem more thoroughly and more effectively than a homogeneous team would. Just like the bucket handle with the team at Home Depot, when all of the perspectives were coming from people who are biologically predisposed to have a slightly better upper body strength, there was a giant blind spot. Nobody thought to think, what about somebody that does not share our physiological attributes? Also known as the other half of our population limit. And because they just did not have that experience in the room, they didn't even think to ask the question. Now, obviously, once presented with it, they were able to come up with a solution, but they were missing even the perspective they needed to ask the question until somebody with a different perspective was brought in. And so the reason why inclusion is so important is because those teams only make better decisions if they stay intact over time, which means that the people you bring in, the different perspectives you bring in, have to stay there. They have to want to stay around. You can't put a bunch of people in a room for a weekend, call it a diverse team, and expect these great results. It's not going to happen. They're not going to know each other. They're not going to trust each other. They're not going to have built the kind of rapport, what is sometimes called in change management, the storming and the norming, where you have this team that sort of has to get through this initial period of chaos and conflict. And once that's managed, then they will begin to create this stability that will allow them to begin making decisions as a unit. But that only happens if everybody sticks around. So inclusion is that vital second piece, because otherwise what you're going to find yourself in if you're managing organizations is you're going to find yourself in this constant loop of trying to find different perspectives and watching those different perspectives eventually walk out the door. And then you've got to bring in new people, and then you've got to go through that whole process all over again, building trust and building rapport, and people getting to know each other, and then you're not going to be able to sustain that because you're constantly trying to add new people, because you're constantly losing people who aren't been there because they don't feel valued, they don't feel a part of the organization, they don't feel like they want to be there because they don't feel included. It's obviously diverse, but they don't feel included. And so that is the essential piece. And that's why we talk about managing diversity, because diversity is something that has to be actively tended to. It has to be actively managed. This is something that is important. Like I said, I gave you a couple of like the practical reasons on Wednesday. A few more practical reasons is because as you are managing organizations, as you are working in different industries and different spaces, you are going to be competing against organizations that have, to some degree or another, based on their successes, done this already. Okay, and so if you are, going back to the example, if you are a bucket manufacturer trying to figure out how to sell buckets to a predominantly female market, you are competing against companies that have already done things like create diverse teams, create teams with multiple perspectives. They're going to figure out to put a bucket on the bottom, or a handle on the bottom of their bucket long before you will. That's sort of one of the shocking things about that whole story, is that nobody else figured it out first. And I guess it's just evidence that nobody else had realized the importance of bringing in different views to that discussion. But other companies are going to have done, other organizations are going to have done this, and they are doing this. This is the direction that companies are heading, and so you're going to be competing against other organizations that have already done this. If you fail to do this, or if you refuse to do this, or if you don't do this well, you are giving up a significant competitive advantage, giving your competition the ability to see things more broadly and more deeply, and to build teams that make better decisions than yours, simply because they brought more voices to the table and managed that well. So it's essential that we manage this well because it provides a significant competitive advantage. It's also important to manage this well because, especially in this context, if you choose to remain in the United States, and really if you choose to participate in most significant economies on the planet, the people participating in these markets are not homogenous. Okay? America is known as the melting pot for a lot of different reasons, but one of the things that creates is it creates a workforce and it creates a customer base that don't all look, sound, act, and think the same way. Even people that have the same needs, you think about some basic needs for food, water, shelter, etc. I could be a grocer, farmer, I can make clothes, I can build houses. Even still, just because everybody needs clothes doesn't mean everybody wears the same types of clothes. You see that across multiple dimensions of identity in society. Customers wear different clothes. That's why there's different clothing manufacturers, different styles. People live in different kinds of houses, there's different expectations about the size of the house, the features of the house, the materials of the house is going to be made out of, things of that nature. We'll eat different foods. So even those common needs, to say nothing of our modern comforts and inventions that each of us may have different tastes and perspectives on what do we need. I need a cell phone, I don't need a computer. I need a TV, I don't need a car. Those things are very culturally linked, but even the things we all share, we all need clothes, we all need shelter, we all need food, the way we even participate in those is influenced by our backgrounds and our cultures and our perspectives. And so if you're going to be an organization, you're going to hire people to work in your organization, and you're going to produce goods and services to sell to a customer base. If you're not able to meet those various demands and understand the cultural behaviors that drive the consumer demands and that help you to take care of your human resources in your organization, you're not going to succeed for very long. You're not going to be able to compete in a marketplace of ideas and a marketplace of multiple perspectives if you only have one. Or if you do succeed, if you do manage to find that niche market, you've preemptively capped your growth. You're only ever going to get as big as you have that many customers that already share your vision, that already share the particular way that you do things, the particular goods and services that you provide. It may be enough to sustain your organization, but your organization won't grow. And if that market moves, if that market's demand changes, then you're immediately going to be rocked by that. You're immediately going to feel every fluctuation in the marketplace because there's no sense of a broad appeal to a large group of people. And so from a strictly business management practical perspective, inclusion is vital. Because I can get any customer to walk in the door of a place once, but if that customer does not feel like their needs are being met, if that customer does not feel comfortable shopping in a particular space, if they don't feel comfortable buying certain things from certain teams of people that are producing them, that are providing them, they're not going to become repeat customers. You're not going to build a consistent customer base. You saw this with your simulation. Okay, the teams that had the best brand awareness and the highest customer satisfactions tended to trend in the same upward direction the entire time during the simulation, because it's more expensive. It's always more expensive to bring in new customers. You have to spend more money in advertising. You have to provide more discounts and other such enticements to get people to walk in the door and you would try you for the first time. But think about the places that you frequent. You frequent them because on some level you feel comfortable there. Maybe there's a particular meal that you have at a local restaurant that you know every time I order this meal, it's delicious, it's exactly what I want, hits the spot. Maybe there is a clerk at a local store that you go to, and you go to that store specifically because you know that person. As you get older and make bigger and bigger purchases, you start purchasing appliances and vehicles and houses and making investments into your future and 401ks and IRAs and the like. You're going to gravitate naturally toward people that you trust. So what you want to do as a business owner, as a manager, you want to create a team that not only feels comfortable working there, but creates a team of people that creates a space where your customers feel comfortable. And you do that to effectively managing conclusion. Does that make sense? I don't want to beat the horse. I don't want to belabor the point, but it's a pretty significant one. It's a pretty important one. If you've ever been someplace and felt uncomfortable, felt like you stuck out, like you didn't fit in, I've experienced that time and time again, as I'm sure that you have. I can remember once I had a family member get married and took all of us that were attending the wedding, we were in the wedding, took us to a restaurant. I thought, okay, yeah, I've been to restaurants. Took us to an extremely nice restaurant. I mean, extremely nice restaurant. And the entire time I felt uncomfortable. Every eye that was on me, I'm not an extremely fancy person. I don't come from a very wealthy background. Until literally a few years ago, I didn't even own like a suit. I mean, I had button-up shirts, and that was about as fancy as I got. And we're in this restaurant where at the door they were like, "You take your jacket," and I'm like, "I don't have a jacket." And there was, "Oh," and you could just immediately tell, "You're not the kind of person that normally eats here." Like, "No, I'm not." And I was like, "Chicken tenders?" And they're like, "No, lamb or veal." And I'm like, "Whoa, those are not things I normally eat." And so there was very much a feeling of like, holy cow, I don't belong here. I was afraid to like drop a glass and that they make me wash dishes for 6 hours because that glass was probably worth a few $100s. Like I was uncomfortable the entire, and it was delicious. The food was great, but it was the most uncomfortable meal I've ever eaten in my entire life. I just did not fit. I didn't fit in. It wasn't the kind of food I normally ate. It wasn't the kind of atmosphere I liked to eat it in. And there were people around me that were having the best time, and I felt great for them. And inside, I was just like, I need to go to a McDonald's or something. That's more on my like culinary level. And that's one example. That's one thing, but that's the kind of thing that will prevent customers from returning. When they feel that just like, I don't like it here. Nobody did anything to me that was mean. Nobody was unkind or rude. I got phenomenal service. I just didn't fit. I didn't belong there. I didn't want to stay there. So as soon as the meal was over, I was gone. I was out the car. That's what you don't want to have happen to your customers, because your customers won't come back. They won't continue to patron your organization. They won't continue to buy what you're selling. You have to constantly search for new customers. So we create inclusive spaces. We create workplaces where people want to come to work and where people want to come and do their business. By keeping in mind some of the things we talked about at the end of Wednesday, of being aware of just simply of the broad variety of perspectives regarding different elements that make people feel comfortable or uncomfortable. So I talked a little bit about the Confederate flag at the very end. And the point I was making there is that for some people, that is a symbol of regional pride. That's a symbol of heritage. That's a symbol of maybe their family history. And for some people, it's a very, very positive symbol. For other people, it's not at all. It's an extremely negative symbol. It's a symbol that makes people feel extremely uncomfortable. And I made the comparison. There are a lot of people who feel about the Confederate flag the way that most people feel about seeing the Nazi flag. It's that same. And my point is not that one or the other perspective is correct. My point is that both of those perspectives exist, and for different reasons, based on their backgrounds, based on their experiences. Both of those perspectives are very, very strongly and sincerely held. Now, here's the thing. Whether or not you agree with either of those perspectives or not is completely irrelevant. The point is that people that want to work in your organizations are going to hold those perspectives. And so you have to, as a manager, you have to make a decision. I mentioned the strong brother, weak brother argument because for me, that's a framework that allows me to honor both of those people. Okay? I can choose to remain completely neutral and say, I'm not going to make a decision in this regard at all. I'm not going to have an opinion. I'm going to remain Switzerland. I'm just going to let you do whatever you want. And I can essentially choose not to manage that particular aspect of inclusion. I can choose to just abstain entirely and say making a decision in either direction would be choosing a side, and I don't want to choose a side, so I'm just not going to do it at all. And I can allow my employees to come into work with the Confederate flag on their hat, or I can allow my employees to hang a Confederate flag in their office. And then when somebody comes to me and says, that makes me extremely uncomfortable, that makes me feel like I don't belong, that makes me feel very unwelcome, I can say, listen, I understand where you're coming from, and I really wish I could help you, but we have a strict no decision policy on this. We're not going to take any action one way or the other. If you have a problem, go talk to that person, but we're just not going to act. And that's what a lot of companies will do about that particular instance and about other things, is they'll just say, you know what, we're going to manage this by just not managing. We're just going to remain completely neutral. We're just not going to have an opinion because we don't want to have an opinion on things that make people upset or that make people feel uncomfortable. And so we're just going to act like the problem doesn't exist. That's part of the reason why, as uncomfortable as this is, and believe me, I don't like this week a whole lot either. These are some pretty uncomfortable and unfortunately, especially this year, politically charged topics. I don't bring my politics into the classroom for a particular set of reasons, even though this week it may have seemed like that's what I've been doing. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we don't have the luxury of choosing not to address it. It doesn't make the problem go away. It doesn't make the feelings not exist. And it doesn't mean by choosing not to engage or choosing to make a decision that we've somehow solved it or kept that. We just don't have a policy on that because we don't want to discuss. That's not what we do in this company. So we're just not going to have a policy on it. You've not really done that. You've just abdicated and sort of left things to chance. What is effective management of inclusion, and this is from the literature, this is a specific example, but it's meant to illustrate the larger principle, is to have a policy, to take a position as management that says controversial symbols aren't allowed in this workplace. It's not saying that your symbol is bad. It's not saying that the things you believe are bad or that you're bad for believing them. But it's saying in this space, we value people feeling comfortable coming to work. We value customers feeling comfortable doing business here. And so symbols that make people uncomfortable, we're not going to have them in the workplace. And so what that means is that no, you cannot wear your Confederate flag hat to work. And no, you cannot wear your Black Lives Matter shirt to work. And no, you cannot, and the list goes on and on and on. But again, it doesn't create a space where you've taken a side. Other than you've taken active steps to manage inclusion in your workplace so that everybody feels comfortable at work and feels like this is a space where I can belong. Does that make sense? Does that maybe help to clarify some of my comments on Wednesday? Hopefully, maybe. The point is not about the flag or the race or the sex or any of the other specifics. The specific examples that I'm giving. The point is that we have to be conscious of and actively manage, which is the point of this, is to actively manage inclusion. We have to write policies, we have to make decisions, we have to take positions that actively work to include everybody in our workforce and everybody in our customer base, and to create spaces where there is neutrality there. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that sort of engages. So as we're doing, as we're thinking of practical ways to manage inclusion, that's one of the big ones. You have to write policies that are inclusive. You have to think about jobs in terms of the specific requirements for the job. Now, there are certain positions that are traditionally held by men, and there are certain positions that are traditionally held by women. And so one of the temptations, one of the, I think, normal behaviors, and again, this is not out of malice, I don't think, or any moral or ethical deficiency of the people making management and hiring decisions, but we tend to see men in certain roles, and we tend to see women in certain roles. And so when those roles become vacant, when people retire or quit or get promoted or what have you, we tend to replace somebody with somebody else a lot like them, because we tend to see that role as being fit for that particular type of person, whatever that looks like. So you wind up with a lot of secretarial, administrative support staff are very often female. A lot of positions that are more physical, or that are dirty, or that are outside, are very often overwhelmingly male. Now think about it. There's been a lot of construction going on for my Tennessee students. There's been a lot of construction going on Kindred Chapel, Kimberly Heights Road. There's been a lot of construction, and so they've had at various times. They've had teams of people out there that are flagging teams, and their job is to hold up the sign that says stop. Okay, and then the other person flips their sign around and it says slow, because they've got it down to one lane. And everybody from one direction will go through, and then they'll flip it, and then the other person, over here, the other person, okay, go, and then they'll flip it slow. You've driven through that, right? Or even if not here, you've driven through that somewhere where there's a team of people out there working traffic. So those people have to stand outside in safety gear in the heat of the day, directing traffic. And more often than not, those people are men. More often than not. To the point where, I don't know about you, but it sort of stands out to me when there's a woman on that team. Because you generally, when you think of that position, you probably generally think of a guy. This is an exercise I like to do with people. You're sitting at home, your toilet clogs up, you can't get it free with a plunger, you call a plumber, 30 minutes later, there's a knock on the door, it's the plumber, you open the door, in your mind's eye, who do you see? Probably see a guy. That guy is probably middle-aged, maybe a little bit overweight, because what's the joke that everybody makes about plumbers? Plumbers crack, right? Okay, so there's sort of a type, and that's actually what it's called, is you have in your mind's eye, from your personal experiences, from media depictions, from people that you've known, of what's called the archetype of that particular type of person. So when you think of a plumber, you think of you have this particular image that pops into your mind. You think of a secretary, you have this particular image that pops into your mind. You think of a librarian, you think of what? You think of probably a middle-aged woman with the horn-rimmed glasses and the hair probably done tight, professionally short, we have certain archetypes or stereotypes in our mind of certain positions. And so what there can be, the very easy result of that is that when we hire for certain positions, we're looking for certain types of people, even subconsciously. Like we may not actively be saying, I only want to hire a woman for this role, or I only want to hire a man for this role. But somewhere just deep in our subconscious, as you're sitting there and you're trying to think about things, and we use words like culture fit. And don't get me wrong, culture fit is an extremely important thing to consider. But as we're sitting there thinking culture fit, subconsciously we're like, I don't think this person would fit in this role. Part of that may be, you don't look the way I thought you would. You don't look like somebody that would do well in this role. Sometimes that just explicitly comes out. Again, I've got hiring horror stories. And I actually once, after a round of interviews for a department supervisor position, had one of my peers, we had done a group interview. One of my peers, as we were debriefing in the office later alone, it was like, yeah, she just doesn't, I don't know, she just doesn't look like a department supervisor. What does that mean? Like, what does a department supervisor look like? He had in his mind this archetype, this stereotype of like, this is what a department supervisor in a hardware store looks like, and she didn't fit it. I mean, it could have been because she was a woman, she could have been too young, she could have been too old, she could have been, I don't know what that looked like for him, but in his mind, he was like, oh, I don't think she'd fit. And that's sort of the danger of not thinking through a position really thoroughly. He had these unexamined predispositions, hitting my shield again, and these unexamined predispositions that he expected certain things to happen. And when I pressed him on it, I was like, well, what is a department supervisor supposed to look like? He was like, what? I don't know, she just wasn't it. He hadn't really thought through what he meant by that phrase. That was just the thing that felt like the thing he needed. That was the only way he knew how to describe the cognitive dissonance that he was experiencing. Is she doesn't look like a department supervisor. And so we have to think through our experiences. I talked early on Wednesday about kind of knowing ourselves and knowing our own biases, our own predispositions, because that's really important. If we expect to see a certain type of person in a certain position, as we're making management decisions, as we're making hiring decisions, promotion decisions, retention decisions, training, things of that nature, our decisions are going to be influenced on some level by the biases that we have, whether or not we're conscious we even have the biases. This is one of the things that I think that our general conversation around diversity and inclusion sort of breaks down a little bit. There are a group of people, or there's a narrative out there that goes something along the lines of X group of people are very, very biased and therefore very, very bad. They're prejudiced, they're biased, and therefore they're bad. This group of people are not biased, they're not prejudiced, therefore they're good, right? You've heard some version of that trope at some point, I'm sure. And it's just the psychological research just does not bear that out. To be human is to have biases. End of story. I can say you have bias because you're alive and because you've experienced things. You have bias, I have bias, the Pope has bias, Gandhi has bias. Everybody, by virtue of their humanity, by virtue of being alive and having experienced things, is biased in some way. When I walk into a kitchen and the burner on a stove is hot, I am prejudiced against that burner because I have in the past been burned. And so it doesn't matter if the burner's actually hot. It doesn't matter if I'm anywhere close to the problem, I immediately become cognizant, because this is the way that our brains are designed. I immediately become cognizant of the thing I have experienced in the past, and I want to stay away from it. And so when we go somewhere and we have a bad experience, when I go to a McDonald's and I order my food and it takes me 20 minutes to get the wrong thing, I will drive by a different McDonald's in a different state, run by a completely different group of people, and I will think, I don't want to go to McDonald's. They take forever to get my order wrong. Rationally, that doesn't make any sense. It was a completely different restaurant that screwed your order up last time, right? But you have sort of this bias that builds in, this prejudgment, this prejudice, which is literally what prejudice means, this prejudgment to say, based on my previous experiences, this is what I think. And we do it in little innocuous ways all the time. And so anybody that tells you that they are not biased, or anybody that tries to make the impression that, well, I don't have any bias, or you should overcome your bias, or you should do away with it, that's literally cognitively impossible. There's only one thing you can do with bias, and it's become aware of it. It's just to simply be aware that you have them, and be aware of what they are. Again, this is to say nothing of the validity of the bias. There are a lot of people who have different experiences that bias them in all kinds of different ways. And the point is not to say, well, this is a bias that's okay to have, this is a bias that's not okay. That's the wrong conversation we have. You have biases, you have prejudices, you have, by virtue of having experienced things, you have certain things that you gravitate toward and certain things that you gravitate against. You have certain thoughts and ideas that pop into your mind, and you have certain thoughts and ideas that never cross your mind because of your experiences. That's how you handle that, is you simply reflect on, what are the things that come into my mind when I think of this? What are the feelings that I have that come up with me when I'm in certain situations, when I talk to certain people, when I think about certain experiences? What have I experienced that leads me to lean one way or the other? There's a lot of really cool cognitive social psychology research that tells us, because we like to think of ourselves as pretty rational people, right? And I mean, we're on a college campus. That's the whole point of a lot of this, is we are trying to become more rational, more thinking. We want to think more critically. We want to learn more. We want to understand better. So that when we're in these positions, we can make the right decision, right? Like, that's why you're taking a management class. You want to learn tools so that you can make the right decisions, make the best decisions. There's a significant amount of social science research that tells us that very little of our decisions, if any ever, are ever purely rational. And in fact, you have what is called momentary affect. Affect is just, it's a term in this context that essentially means almost an emotional disposition, okay? As you experience things, you may eventually think through them rationally, but in the microseconds of experience, of exposure, you have flashes of affect, flashes of emotion, where a completely different part of your brain engages. And if you've experienced something with that before, you will have, and it may be faint and it may be massive, depending on the experience, depending on the level of trauma, depending on a lot of different things related to how your brain stored that memory, that are not just extra rational, but are in fact non-rational. They're emotional. And so even though eventually our rational brains will engage that, our pre-rational reaction will bias us in a certain direction. And so the analogy that one particular psychologist uses is that of a rider and his elephant. And the writer is the rational one. The writer is the one making the plans, making the rational decisions. But the elephant is that first initial reaction. And so the thought is that, and now I've never ridden an elephant, but I've ridden a horse, and so I can imagine that it's kind of the same thing. You can tell that animal where to go eventually, but if that animal freaks out for any reason, that animal has that flash of fear. Nothing you say or do is going to get that horse to calm down. Nothing you say or do is going to get that elephant to do. Now, you may be able to lead it in a certain direction once you get control. But if that elephant doesn't want to, that elephant isn't going to listen to you. It's going to go wherever it wants. And so he makes the analogy that that's the difference between our rational thought and our emotional experience, is that yes, we have these rational thoughts, and we should do our best to make good rational decisions. We also have to understand that the way our brains work is that when those moments of emotion take over, when those biases flash, when those prejudices pop up, even though we may eventually say, that's stupid, I shouldn't think like that. That's irrational, I shouldn't do it that way. That initial reaction, that initial lead of the elephant is going to be strong, because it's a much more fundamental part of our actual psychological makeup. Our rational brain is the newest part of our brains. It's in some ways the weakest part of our brain. The stuff that makes the rest of us move and almost have an animalistic sort of tribal, what we would call primitive or base functions, is a different part of the brain. And so when we're talking about bias in this context, we're talking about, I'm going to shut this off because I don't know why I